Hi, welcome to Bookmark. I'm your host, Don Noble. My guest today is the novelist Margaret Verble, author most recently of the novel When Two Feathers Fell from the Sky. This unusual and inventive novel tells the story of a horse diver, Two Feathers, a Cherokee, and involves ghosts, graves, and animals with spirits. I spoke with Margaret Verble in Studio UA in the Digital Media Center on the campus of the University of Alabama. Well, Margaret Verble, it is nice of you to come in today.
Thank you for having me, Don. I'm glad to be here.
They're keeping you busy. The Honors College has brought you to campus.
They have.
And what have they had you doing?
Well, they've had me eating a lot. I've eaten a lot here, and I'll have to say it's good food. And I have talked to a class, and I have been in a series of conversations with students.
Mhm.
And I think we have a presentation tonight.
Are you going to speak or read or both?
I am going to be interviewed.
Well.
Students will provide the questions, and I'll respond to them.
Well, think of this as training.
Good. I need as much training as I can get.
You have not been on this show before, so you're new to our audience, and people would like to know something about you. Where are you from? Where did you go to school? What do you do for a living?
Well, I was raised in Nashville,
Ah.
and I live in Lexington, Kentucky.
Mm-hmm.
My family is in Oklahoma, so I have spent my life going back and forth between Lexington or Nashville and Oklahoma my entire life. And I write books for a living, and then I have another line of work that I do that will distract everybody if I tell you about it. So
You've done it already.
I know, I'm sneaky like that.
Yeah. Well, Nashville is and among the things that people do know about you is that you are a registered member of the Cherokee Nation. Is that the right term for that?
I'm a Cherokee citizen.
And what does that mean? Is that
Well,
you have one grandparent, four grandparents, what?
Well, what that means is that I am a citizen of the Cherokee Nation.
Yes.
And there are 3 federally recognized Cherokee tribes, and the Cherokee Nation is the largest one of them. And in order to be a member of it, you have to be able to prove your genealogy.
Yes.
From being on federal rolls, and my family was on federal rolls for generations.
Right.
And have to be recognized as Cherokee, which, it's not hard to do. Or for me, I grew up, my family, my mother's first cousin was our tribal attorney for 40 years. So I grew up in a family that was, interested in Cherokee politics and knowledgeable about our history.
Mostly in Oklahoma.
In Oklahoma,
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, my mother was the only one of them that was not in Oklahoma, and that's because a World War II soldier came along and kidnapped her and took her back east.
Recently, just by chance, a graduate of the University of Alabama, a young man named Lukerson, wrote the history of the Tulsa Massacre.
Oh, is that right? I have not read that, but I've read 3 or 4 books on that. It's fascinating.
It is amazing. One of the things about aside from the massacre itself, was that one of the most unfortunate things that happened in Oklahoma to Black Oklahomans was statehood. Because then the state legislature started making laws that modeled the Mississippi Jim Crow laws.
Mm-hmm. Yes, they did.
In Two Feathers, what happens with statehood and right afterwards is the move from the reservation property to allotments, and that pops up several times in your novel as really unfortunate. And made possible a lot of evil.
Well, yeah, what happened was the state of Oklahoma was created
Yeah.
out of the land that had been given to the tribes that had been removed there from the
Yeah,
east,
right.
for as long as grass grows and water flows. And that land, plus what was called the Oklahoma Territory, which was really unassigned lands, were combined together into the state of Oklahoma in the violation of Lord knows how many treaties.
Right.
And as a result of that, each member of the tribes got allotments. Native land is held in common,
Right.
but it was individually allotted out, and this allowed the government to steal vast tracts of native land. And then also people came in and preyed on native peoples and
Right.
stole their land individually.
Yes.
So it was a very unfortunate situation.
In this novel, which takes place just about 100 years ago
That's right, just about 100 years ago.
in Nashville, in fact, I was making little notes to myself. One of the things about Two Feathers is the action takes place 100 years ago, but the references in the novel are very often to 1826 and Trail of Tears and the removal and Oklahoma Territory and so on. But I have some very specific questions.
Okay.
Were there really buffalo herds in Nashville at any time?
Yes.
There were.
Yes.
How do we know?
Well, we know because there were, well, for one thing, pioneers kept records of that, and we
Yeah.
have it in the written record. And for another thing, there are buffalo traces that the roads still in Nashville are based on. I mean, there's a road, which I think I've mentioned in
sure.
Two Feathers, Granny White Pike. That used to be a buffalo trace. And there was a grand buffalo trace that ran through exactly where this novel is set.
And a trace is where the herd of buffalo went back and forth often enough to make it
Oh,
a foot or
yes.
two
Sometimes
below.
those traces were, 3 feet below the surrounding ground, and buffalo run along those traces, one at a time, and so they're deep paths, and you could see them.
Yeah,
Yeah,
in the novel, when they go looking for it, they find it.
they can find it.
Right, and it's
That's right.
several feet wide and
That's right.
at some point maybe even 2 feet
Yeah.
deep. The novel begins with Two Feathers, who is a horse diver.
She is.
I think somewhere in my life I have seen a picture of this. Describe this business, and how do you get the horses to do it?
It's an odd business. It's not a business I personally would choose to be in. Let
Yeah.
me just say that. But it was very popular from the 1890s on into, well, I think they stopped doing it maybe in the 1970s. There were still people doing it, not many people. But this is basically a stunt that grew out of the Wild West shows,
Sure.
where people were just doing incredible things on horses. I mean, they were standing up on horses, 1 foot on one horse and 1 foot on the other horse, and galloping across uh, uh, pieces of land and shooting things and doing all sorts of things. Well, a guy named Doc Carver decided that it'd be fun to people would like to see horses jump off into water and people be riding them when they did. And so he created this stunt, and it caught on like wildfire. People just loved watching horse divers and horses dive off into pools of water. And, there's no accounting for
So there's a
cost.
long ramp.
There's a long ramp, horse goes up,
Two Feathers
right.
gets on up there bareback
gets on bareback,
and then persuades
and
the horse
then
to jump.
the horse jumps.
Yeah.
You can see this on YouTube. You can see
Ah,
pictures of it. It's just sort of incredible. And from what I understand, no horses were ever killed this way, but divers were injured.
And how is it 40 feet up? How high up did they
Well,
get?
they would go. They were different at different places.
Uh-huh.
I mean, it was all over the country.
Well, in the
People
novel,
love
the
this.
pool is 11 feet deep,
The
which
pool-
doesn't seem deep enough to me.
Well, it doesn't to me either. If I
Right.
was going to have to do it, it'd have to be a lot deeper than that. But Doc Carver figured out the exact dimensions that were perfect for a horse to dive into a pool. And they made those pools pretty uniform across the country because he was the guy that was driving it, and he trained other people to do it. He had
Right.
students, and they spread out, and they built these tanks all over the country, and these horses dived into them.
And they enjoyed it?
Well, if the horses didn't enjoy it, when when they start them off, they'd figure out if some horses like water and some horses don't.
Uh-huh.
And some horses like to jump and some horses don't. I mean, I live in Lexington, Kentucky. I mean, if you live in Lexington, you know that horses have different preferences, just
Right.
like human beings do. And so some horses like to do that and took to it.
Well, I'm going to go look.
I
I
do.
imagine this made the ASPCA crazy.
Well, it would make a lot of people crazy now, I imagine, but people weren't too concerned about it.
There were apparently lots of buffalo in Nashville, and less difficult to believe, lots of Indians, lots of indigenous people. Did they bury in around Middle Tennessee? You say that the dead were buried in kind of stone coffins.
Yes.
Slate,
Yes. This
slates.
is
I've never heard of that.
well, I know, and it was unique to Middle Tennessee. But this is part of the Mississippian culture, which
Mhm.
you're all familiar with down here
Right
in
here.
Alabama, because you
Right.
got Moundville down here. This is the same Mississippian culture, only, people are different in Chicago than they are in Dallas, and people, are diverse everywhere. And for some reason that we don't understand, the Mississippians around in the Nashville Basin developed a mortuary tradition of burying people in stone slabs. And I've seen one of them, and it's a grave about this long with a piece of stone about that high, and then they'd put a stone rock over it, and there was a big Mississippian culture there. And on the site of where this novel is set
Right.
was a big necropolis, 4,000 graves.
And that's where they built the fair, the park, the zoo.
They built that particular piece of land, had that necropolis there. And then that stayed there for a long time. That piece of land was also a Civil War battlefield.
Right.
And then it became a park zoo. And then it became the neighborhood I grew up in.
And in the novel, it is said with considerable bitterness several times that 4,000 graves
Yeah.
were desecrated, moved, destroyed in order to build the park.
That's right. See,
That's a lot of stone.
That's a lot of
coffins.
stone. It's a lot of stone. It's a lot of people to disturb. But what they were doing was that when electricity came to be popular, it came into the cities. And the electric companies all over the United States sold a lot of electricity to people in cities and in office buildings. And then they would, on the weekends, they'd go home. Well, they would go home to more countrified homes that didn't have electricity. And so the electric companies had a business problem. And the business problem was, how do we sell electricity on the weekends? And so they built trolley parks all over the United States. There are trolley parks outside of Lexington, Kentucky, outside of Memphis, outside of Tulsa, outside of Nashville, outside of any number of cities, all built by the electric companies because they could run electrified trolley lines out
Right.
to the countryside. to these places that were just filled with lights. And everybody just loved it. It
Yes.
was recreation, and in the summertime, it was cooler out there in the country than it was in the city, so everybody was thrilled.
Your heroine, Two Feathers, her horse diving act is at this park zoo.
It is.
And she spends a great deal of time in the zoo, what can I say, talking with, at least communing with the animals.
That's right. That would be a natural thing for her to do.
Especially Adam the buffalo, but
Yes.
also she where are we here? The animals have spirits, animals have souls, animals can or cannot communicate with her.
Well, it seems like to me
Yes.
they do. That
Yes.
yes would be the answer to all
Uh-huh.
that.
Uh-huh. And what about the hippopotamus?
Well,
I felt so bad for
I
the
know, I feel
hippopotamus.
bad for the hippopotamus too. Yeah,
She, right. Claire, what is it? What is the hippo's? I've forgotten her name.
well, so have I all of a sudden, but we know it's a hippopotamus.
Right.
There's only one.
Yeah. And she was born and raised in North America. So if there were any like language difficulties, say if she'd been an African hippopotamus,
there's just no telling how the communication problems they would have had she been in Africa. But there was a hippopotamus in Memphis. They were raising hippopotamus.
the owner of the place is this James, this quintessential rich, ambitious, not bright. There's nothing dull about him, but he's less narrow-minded than some.
Mm-hmm.
But he's never going to get on board with animism.
I don't think so.
How the animals have their own spirits. Can anybody communicate, or does Two Feathers, by virtue of being Two Feathers, have powers that enable her to communicate? If I went to the zoo and I tried real hard, I'd fail, right?
Well, I don't know. I don't want to pass judgment on you, not knowing you any better than I do. But I think that Clive Lovett, he communicates with
He
animals.
could do it. All right. In the novel, there are ghost is not the right word. It is involved. There are people we think of as conventionally dead who reappear. There's an Indian little elk.
Little elk.
And then Clive, a friend of Clive from the trenches.
Mm-hmm.
Is reincarnation a Native American belief?
Yes.
Everybody?
Well, now, I cannot speak for everybody because talking about Native Americans is like talking about Europeans.
Well, Cherokees,
there are differences between the Greeks and the Scots. Tremendous differences, and they're the same kind of tremendous differences among the Indian nations in North America.
But one of the I found this to be one of the tenderest moments in the book when Clive has been grieving. I mean, his World War I experiences were horrendous, and he has been grieving all that death, and he has been grieving especially Millwood.
Yes, his cousin,
his friend and cousin who died
next to him, blown up next to him.
And the idea of reincarnation and the eternal spirit just saves his mental health, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's people aren't dead.
Well, I think a spiritual life does save a lot of people's mental health.
Right. And one of the things that's really wrong with the practice of Christianity is that it moved all the spirits from the surface of the earth up into the sky, which is really, I've never seen it said that way exactly.
Yeah.
But the spirits are either up there or they're down there.
That's right.
Whereas with the indigenous peoples, they're all here.
Everywhere, all around us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You have in this novel maybe 3 separate courtships going on. And
Who doesn't like a little romance?
There is a little romance. This is 1926. The apex of the Roaring '20s. People like Fitzgerald and Zelda are going mad at the Plaza Hotel.
Yes.
The people in your novel court as if they were in early Victorian era. I mean, they wait for weeks to hold hands.
Well, of course, the major courtship that's going on there is with Clive and the house mother,
Helen.
Yeah, and they're older. I mean, they're basically Victorians, and there's actually good research on this about people's when sexual mores changed, and so they would court as Victorians.
Yeah, the younger people aren't Scott Fitzgerald either.
No,
they're all
because they're in Nashville. Nashville is not
pretty conservative place.
Nashville's a pretty conservative place.
You watch this for a sentence. Now, you and Faulkner both deal with the question of communal property ownership, or however you wish to describe the way in which Indians share.
Right.
Faulkner does it with Ikamatoobi. You have several people talking about it. There were moments in the 19th century when, or actually the 18th century, when the first white settlers came, whether it was central Alabama or Nashville or wherever, with millennia of private ownership, of millennia of experience in individual ownership of a piece of property, and ran into Native Americans who had this.
Who didn't have a concept of that.
No concept of private ownership. Every time I run into that, and it's in here, it's how in the world, how would that ever have been resolved happily?
Well,
the natives didn't know how to explain, and the new settlers didn't want to hear it.
Yeah,
No, it wasn't
resolved happily.
No.
And one of the problems from a native perspective is that they just couldn't grasp the fact that people thought that they actually personally owned pieces of land. That was just inconceivable.
Mm-hmm.
So they didn't make good negotiators because they just couldn't get it into their heads that people would act like that.
It really, every time you run into that, and it started in Plymouth, Massachusetts.
It started in Europe, yeah.
Well, I mean the conflict between indigenous North American people and European settlers. It's a catastrophe every time.
Every time it's a catastrophe.
When the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock in 1620 and moved over to the mainland, there had been a gigantic epidemic of diseases. 90% of the natives had died in the few years before. The land looked empty to the Englishmen. Mm-hmm. When your white settlers arrive in Nashville, it looks empty to them. Mm-hmm. That looks to me like one of the great historical problems, is that you couldn't get it out of their heads that nobody lived there. And you have people discuss this in the novel.
Yeah, and I have come to wonder how empty it really looked to them. They claimed that it looked empty, but they also trained their dogs to attack and eat Indians. So if I think that I'm going to a place that I have no enemies, I might not train my dogs to do that.
That is a grotesque scene. that,
But true.
oh, yeah, absolutely. You have reincarnation. You have a good deal you have a mystery about a hippopotamus, and you have several courting couples, and you have a big accident in horse diving. But one of the things that's going on in the novel, in various discussions among different people, is a question of what are the similarities and differences, whites, blacks, Indians, people who are some mixture of Indian and black, Indian and white, black, all the possibilities are there. And then down at the courthouse, you have the appeals trial of the Scopes.
That's right.
Trial.
Right.
All right. Now, I hope this isn't too complicated a question, but how does Darwin and evolution work for you in terms of all of the issues of varieties of racism or races? What do you think about that?
Well, I think much more about that than we can put into a television segment. I have
Okay.
a lot of complicated thoughts on that. But you should know that when I plotted this book out, I plotted it out really day by day. And that appeals of the Scopes trial was going on that day
Yeah.
in real life.
Yeah.
So it was very easy to drag that into that book. And because it was such, it was such a overwhelming preoccupation for
Right.
people living in that time. So to have that there in that book at that time and those people go to it was, it was just sort of a gift. Yeah.
And how exactly it works into the other is subject for another day. We only have a minute, really, but I have two tiny questions.
Okay.
One, the power of tobacco in this novel. Little
Yes.
Elk gains in what are almost physical powers from
Yes.
either smelling or inhaling. Is tobacco magic? Is
Oh,
it?
yeah. Yeah.
It is.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a connection between this life and the spirit life.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the other little question is, it seems almost taboo to talk about Indians and alcohol because of this historical issue of the drunken Indian.
Yeah.
But Two Feathers, she has broken leg, she has a lot of pain, she gets some vodka, and it looks to me as if that vodka, like she gets attached to that vodka very quickly.
Well, yeah. She's in pain.
Is there anything going on there? Is she more?
Well, one of the things that's going on is that they wouldn't give her any painkillers because she was a native. And
But she's not more likely to become an alcoholic than somebody
well,
else.
everybody thought she was.
Oh,
And
what do you think?
well, what I think is that anytime you take a group of people and you decimate their entire way of life, it's likely to lead them into some type of addiction.
Well, you have written a very complicated and amazingly entertaining novel.
Oh, thank you.
And I know that there's another one called Stealing that's already
Yes.
out, and
Yes.
we will look for it. And if you come back this way again, we'll talk about it and the next one.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This has been
Pleasure to be with you.
This has been a real pleasure.
Thank you.